We have given the panelists some discussion questions. Oh, we are rejoined. I said Councilmember Helen Roosevelt had been here but had to leave. Well, guess what? She's not back in. So thank you very much, Helen, and for all your work at the city level. So we gave the panelists some discussion questions, but I feel after hearing from everyone, there's probably any number who'd just like to respond to anything they've heard or ask each other a question. So let me first just, Pete Granis. But I'll open it up to Pete Granis.
Obviously, very, very smart people up here, and I think everybody in this room, and certainly the universe of thinking citizens of the world, understand that we have a crisis and we need to deal with it. The focus on fossil fuel extractors is interesting. They obviously have a carbon footprint. But if you really are concerned about the global impact of carbon emissions, you've got to look at all of us. Collectively, we have driven, over the last decades, massive uses of carbon fuel, and we will continue to do so. 90 or 95% of all the carbon fuels burned power our cars, generate energy for our buildings, so we can turn on the lights. We are dependent on fossil fuel, and it's a demand-driven economy. So while we focus on the fossil fuel extractors, I think Elizabeth pointed out more than anything else, is that we need to focus on our collective dependence on fossil fuels. And just, it's an interesting dynamic. Obviously, we are very, very invested in our future as far as looking after the interests of the million people that depend on the Common Retirement Fund for their retirement future. Clearly, the obligation of the fund is to make sure that we use, as Vicki said, the best knowledge we've got, the best tactics we've got, and to use the resources and the power that we do have, not the power we wish we have or we would use if we were in a different setting, but the power of the fiduciary of a $180 billion fund. I just want to ask Stephen one question. And clearly, when you divest, there's no such thing as stranded assets in a divestment. So who is going to be buying the ExxonMobil stock that the Rockefeller brothers are going to be divesting? Because that's the heart of the question. We have a voice. We have a voice that cares because of the controller, because of our investment strategy. We use that voice. It's an important voice. It may not be the definitive voice, but the fact that we can get 38% of a shareholder vote at the ExxonMobil at the last annual meeting on our climate proposal, I think is important. But at least we have a voice. Selling stock to people that don't care, that don't have the voice, that don't want to use the voice, that may be deniers of the whole underpinnings of climate change, and there's still a few of those around. One of them will be on the ballot in a couple weeks. It's a very important, I think, distinction to make sure that it's understood that those of us that care, that those of us that are engaged, those of us that share the global issues that we all care about, starting with the big public pension funds. We're not impact investors, we're not social investors. We are investors that use our voice based on the best available economic information we can get and where we think we can have the best impact with the resources that we've got and the limited authority we've got to use our voice going forward. So, Stephen, who's going to buy those shares that you are going to be divesting?
Well, you're, I don't know, of course. Somebody will buy them, and they may not share our view. But when it comes to voice, I would argue that our voice was amplified far more loudly by divesting than the engagement we tried to do for 10 or 15 years. That was a real use of voice. It reached around the world. And so that was a decision we made to use our brand name plus our assets to make a really important statement that is still relevant.
And so what impact has that had on climate voting in the atmosphere?
Well, what it's having is building a movement of other institutional investors who are divested. And ultimately, this also sends the signal that you and Elizabeth have talked about, which I think is extremely important, that we all have to think about this as a systemic problem comprehensively. But by building a movement of people who say, one step we can take is to divest, is a way of building awareness that this problem is real, it has economic, social, and environmental consequences that are undeniable, and in fact, the carbon-fueled capitalism that we have enjoyed for 300 years is obsolete and has to come to an end urgently. And I think that's the message collectively that we have to deliver.
You know, Pete, now here's the deal.
Just one more-
Pete, no, you're
Just
asking
one
the
more-
wrong question,
I'm
and
not.
it's an unfair question.
Let me
You're
just-
asking, no, Pete, you're asking an unfair question to a fiduciary who's actually taken a reasonable position. The position for the New York State Common Retirement Fund is quite different than the Rockefeller Fund. And hey, hello, you're getting less money from them. Can you get it? That means, I looked at the fund, used to be 2.3% of the retirement fund was in ExxonMobil, 2013. It's now 1.5. That's $900 million less in actual investment money. They used to be producing 10 to 12%. They ain't producing that anymore. They're producing like far less, almost negative returns. You're losing money. You lost money on coal. You're losing money on fossil fuels. Why don't you ask the company about how they're going to turn around their profits? Why don't you ask the company about, you're asking them about climate change. Why don't you ask them about what they're doing to attack Schneiderman and attack the Attorney General in Massachusetts and attack the SEC and using the Congress of the United States to attack climate activists? Why don't you start asking real questions? Stop talking about bullshit. I mean, let's start talking about like what that company is doing, the mismanagement of the fund. If you really see an outlier company, and Exxon has lagged the Standard & Poor's 500 for the last 11 quarters, unprecedented in the 70 years that I've looked at of the company. You ask it any questions about finance? No, you're not. You're not really asking questions
All right, Tom,
of
I'm gonna move it to someone else in a minute, thank you. So Pete, did you have were you cut off or something?
I'm at my
else you
job for a number of years. I was wondering if any of those questions were asked when he was there, so.
So Brad, what else do you want to
Yes,
raise?
I don't know if there's a question I could ask that would enliven this conversation further. But I wanted to thank Senator Krueger and all the panelists. I've taken a lot of notes. You know, I'm curious to know, first I want to say that I think, you know, Controller DiNapoli and his team are doing a terrific job, and I think Senator Krueger and I agree. He is a leader on this issue. I am curious to know from our representatives from the Controller's Office what other large funds are doing. Your peers in other states, CalPERS, for example. I know that, you know, we know that the Rockefeller Brothers Fund divested, but of course that's $825 million and doesn't have the same imprint as was acknowledged as your fund. What are your peers doing in other states?
CalSTRS, I know, is implementing a strategy similar to ours. I think there has been legislation passed in California that at least deals with coal. But my understanding of the position, and this is sort of third party in what I read, the position of the pension funds is, we can get out of these things if we're made whole. So,
Explain that.
meaning that we get out, but any loss we take, if we're wrong, somebody else is going to pony up the money to make us whole, which kind of in a way can result in nothing happening, because who will be the constituency? I mean, the legislature, I guess, who would have to to make the pension funds whole. My understanding, in general, outside of the very large pension funds, where there's been the most pressure, many of them are quietly doing what we're doing. We meet with them, they engage with us, and they're just very happy to stay out of the fray.
So you think it might require a legislative assist to codify a kind of safety net in the event of divestment?
So I'm going to say no. I actually believe, particularly since we know this legislation that has been sort of promulgated for us, we don't believe that's the solution. I mean, we don't have our heads in the sand. Many of us are in the fund ourselves. So we have no interest in seeing a decline in the value of the assets that are available to pay our pension fund. We just approach it as investors. And so no amount of yelling and screaming is going to inform the discussion. We do ask the questions, and we don't go back and sit on our thumbs. We ask the questions. If we don't, we've sued companies in the past. We have voted against their, whether board members, et cetera. So we are active, but what's missing from and I understand the urgency, but you can't ask, you can, but I would say, think about the fact that just as you're talking to us about fossil fuels, someone else is talking to us about, I mean, there are lots of initiatives.
Well, if I could just follow up with that, one more
Yeah,
follow-up. Like, what is different with fossil fuels versus other toxic investments like guns and cigarettes?
Well, in the case of guns, the way we approached it was from a research standpoint and a de minimis effect. The exposure of our passive strategies to guns was very different than our exposure to fossil fuels. But let me just echo something that Pete says. You know, since we're focused on emissions, we keep talking about the supply side of the chain. When we looked at the emissions contribution for capitalization, there was utilities, there were retailers, there were industrial companies. And the way we're thinking about it is let's attack the users of fossil fuels as well. Let's not just say that the easy target is the guy with the assets in the ground.
But nobody's saying that. Yeah, nobody's saying divestment is the only thing we should do, right? We have to have
Right.
a comprehensive solution to the problem. We've got to have everything in.
So, I'm sorry, just to clarify, Vicky. So is the state pension fund exploring, or has it decreased its investment in those kinds of companies?
Yes, the low carbon index is focused on demand. And so the underweighting or the zeroing out of exposure is across extractors, industrial companies, utilities, et cetera. And the engagement strategy is also going to be focused beyond just fossil fuel companies.
And so Mark and Thomas, because you are specifically involved in evaluating and making you make recommendations to investors on how to invest exclusive of the fossil fuels.
Can I ask a question now, please?
Sure.
How do you create the demand on renewables? How are you working with other parts of government to ensure that that demand is on the ground, that we are investing and creating renewables, and that we're taking people away from fossil fuel extraction? Because I'm not convinced that that the people who are getting the pensions, if they had a choice between surviving and getting a check, that they would pick the check. I'm not convinced about that, and I'm not convinced that they have all the information that they need to make more informed choices. And so I'd like to know how you're working in an interagency way, and how you're working with economists, and coming up with the financial engineering so that we can move this fossil dependent industry or investments to 100% renewable. So I'd like to know more about what's being done to do that.
You want to take that? Or you want
Sure, and I'll go and take the discussion.
So our strategy is three-pronged. Well, maybe it's four, because it's research, low carbon indexes.
Talking to the mics, please.
I'm sorry.
They're not hearing you, speak to the mic.
Oh, I'm sorry. Research, low carbon, the low carbon strategy we announced was sort of just an important down payment relative to our index strategies, which are really the lion's share of what we do. The third is engagement, and the fourth is investment. We have been investing in sustainable strategies for many years, and the reason that the comptroller publicly announced that we have, at a minimum, targeted another $1.5 billion for renewable strategies was to let people know that we wanted to hear from them on sustainable strategies. We have now implemented our investment principles for sustainable investment, and we are looking right now at least four providers of services. So the way we do it is to say we want to invest. That's the easiest thing for us to say. Now, we're always going to be looking for a financial return as well as a non-financial return. So it has to be double bottom line. But given where the state of play is in industries like solar and wind, we believe we are now at a point where we can actually generate the sort of returns we need to get, and at the same time, be encouraging renewable strategies.
Thank you. And then going back to the point I was going to ask Mark and Thomas and Carol. since your investors, I mean, obviously not of the size of the New York State Pension Fund, but you are the advisors to investors who say the portfolio mix ought not have these worst oil and gas producers in them. Do you agree or disagree with the state that they can't get the return they need to make sure they get for our pensioners and do their due diligence and fiduciary responsibility if they pull out of fossil fuels?
They never asked.
Well, I was gonna ask.
They've never asked their, which is what the point is.
No, but I'm asking.
They've never asked their
I'm
pension
asking
fund
Mark
advisors.
and.
First of all, it's incorrect.
Thomas.
That's absolutely incorrect.
That's absolutely correct.
Absolutely, no, it's not.
You
are
have
not
never
sitting in
produced,
the room.
you have never
You are
produced,
not sitting in
you
the
have
room
never
somewhere.
produced an asset allocation study and never asked your advisors that said, tell us how in the next 5 to 10 years, how we will get out of fossil fuels. The asset allocation study that you adopt every couple of years has never been performed in that manner with that scenario. I ran these things, I know exactly what you need to do, I know who you need to get to do this, and you've never asked the study.
Okay, but I'm
All
asking
you've
some of our
asked
other
for-
panelists what their
Okay.
opinion is
And-
right
and-
now.
But let me put one other quick thing. On the renewable strategy, what Vicki just outlined is the absolute right thing for a very large pension fund to involve itself in. Because we have, the way the markets are going in renewable energy, we need very large funds with high degrees of liquidity that can take a long-term perspective. And that's really important. I may be, you heard me be critical of Tom DiNapoli, but you may have also forgotten what I said, which is he's the best in the world on this. And that's an issue that
So
we
Tom, we only
on
have
that.
10 minutes left looking at the
Yeah,
clock,
well,
so I'm gonna, again, try the question with
Yeah.
the people who do investing and advise investing.
If I may.
Please.
First of all, I should be clear, while I said that $10 trillion is benchmarked to MSCI index, we do no investing. We don't,
Right.
and
Right,
we
so
don't
I
give, and we don't give
advise.
investment advice. But I will say this, I want to go back to some of the details of the low carbon strategies that I referenced earlier, because I think there are some very important underlying principles there. The first is that using a risk-controlled approach to reducing carbon exposures in portfolios. You can reduce emissions exposure on the magnitude of 75 to 80% emissions exposure, and you can reduce reserves exposure on the magnitude of 90+%. In other words, you're 90% of the way there to divestment. You get the added benefit of also limiting exposure to emissions, which is another way in which carbon asset risk comes into portfolios, and you're controlling risk at the same time. So the issue here is that there are ways that investors, and indeed, there's the low carbon approach that that New York State Common is taking now. There are ways of reducing your exposure along the way to the companies that are the ones driving the fossil fuel industry these days. And so I just want to make sure this isn't seen as an either or. You're either doing nothing or not. So that's one thing. The second thing is, I just want to point out again, we have a mutual fund, we have a foundation, and we have a pension fund. The fiduciary obligations at each of these is different. So when we say fiduciary duty, it isn't a single set of obligations and principles. And I think that I would go back to my earlier comment that what's really important here is that there are a number of different avenues that are being used in order to address the risk itself and to address these issues to the companies. And I think that there isn't a single right way. There are many paths to achieving the objectives of reducing, if that's the ultimate objective, to reducing the ability of fossil fuel companies to extract and burn fossil fuels. This can be achieved through a number of different avenues.
And And then Mark also
Yeah.
seems to be interested in.
Yes, to be clear, Carbon Tracker, we're a non-profit think tank. We provide information and research which is publicly available for pension funds to use. Some of the largest pension schemes in the world, funds like the Norwegian State Pension Scheme, which is, I think, 3 times the size of the New York pension schemes, have divested from coal, and they've also sold down a number of oil and gas stocks. AXA, which is a global insurance company, has divested completely from coal, as has the Dutch insurance company Aegon. And so around the world we do find major global financial institutions, pension schemes and insurance companies selling off their fossil fuel holdings. But some of the reasons for that are just purely down to investment risk. Some of it is due to them taking a bigger perspective, and I want to raise this, which is that we're in the middle of an energy transition. A rapid winding down of fossil fuels will take place, certainly over the next couple of decades, and a replacement with a low carbon technologies. We can either have an orderly transition where companies properly plan their winding down and we decarbonize the energy sector and the transportation sector, or we could leave it to the last minute and we could have what you would call a disorderly transition, where we leave it another 20, 30 years and then we'll have Hurricane Sandy on speed 5 times in the same kind of decade instead of every 50 years, which would cause governments and others to act, and in a way where there will be severe dislocations to the economy, to employment, and to the value of pension schemes' investments. And in a disorderly transition, I think probably at that point trustees, fiduciaries would look and think, have we missed the chance to act earlier? Have we lost the opportunity because there's no going back at that point? And so what does an orderly transition look like? I think where we are, what I see with initiatives such as the Portfolio Decarbonisation Coalition is alliances of progressive pension schemes and insurance companies working together with goals, with clear targets to say, to get to 2 degrees, this does mean a winding down of the carbon entangled economy. It isn't just about the fossil fuel stocks, that's true. It's entangled throughout the economy. It's the whole infrastructure of the fossil fuel economy that is a risk to the pension scheme. So it's those types of targeting, and it's the exercise of shareholder power together, but with a purpose. And the purpose isn't a little less emissions from an oil refinery. The purpose has to be a planned winding down over the next couple of decades of this industry before it really takes us over an edge, which is irreversible. And I think there's a chance to do this now. But what I'd love to see is more of those types of ambitious goal setting, where the underlying portfolio managers who look after these funds, where they're actually given specific guidance on how to engage with companies and how to go about doing this, and where it is important to get out of certain sectors and stocks and to invest in the cleaner sectors as well.
And Carol, you also have a question.
Sure. So I'll start off by saying at Domini, especially related to fossil fuel, we strongly believe that the past will not look like the future does. And at Domini, we think that our value in looking at these social and environmental standards in the process helps us to be more forward-looking than most financial managers are, which rely very much on indicators that may not show them the way ahead. So looking at the uniqueness of fossil fuel, and as many have pointed out here, really cutting across many asset classes, we were left with the challenge of where it's most logical to begin. And we thought, well, who is least incentivized to move to the clean energy economy that we need? And that was the people that own the energy that's currently in the ground. We then worked very closely with our financial sub-manager to see that they could implement in that risk-controlled environment, not owning those producers and refiners with the reserves in the ground, and manage the portfolio in a way that would offer competitive market-like returns. So I'll point out that our mutual fund is benchmark to public benchmarks, not customizing DEX, which eliminates fossil fuels. So we believe it can be done. We think it, as a philosophy, we believe the standards we use are performance enhancing and will deliver competitive returns while also adding value to society.
Thank you. So it's just about 12 o'clock, so I'm going to be the bad guy. First off, I want to point out, I think this entire panel actually agrees with each other. May not always look like that, and we may not exactly agree on how we get there and how quickly we get there, but I think that listening to everyone today, there's no doubt that we think we have to up the ante on moving us off of fossil fuels and ensuring that we do not risk the closing window on our opportunity to save the earth. So I carry a bill. I know that Tom DiNapoli doesn't agree with me, fine, which would actually require divestment over a 5-year period. As I continue to point out and say publicly, if the controller's office wants to get us out another way without an official divestment, that's fine. I just want us out of fossil fuels because I think it's bad for us and the pension players long term. It's clearly bad for our goals in global climate change. Yes, they are also right. Anything and everything we can do to lower consumer demand and invest more in low carbon investments, great. So, and yes, Tom Tanzillo, thank you for your passion. I don't disagree with you either that we should ask harder questions. We should try to get this moving faster than not slower. Elizabeth brought in the community perspective on the critical nature of every decision we make is perhaps a decision not to make another better decision for our
Can I just say
communities.
something? I'm sorry to interrupt, but I don't want to be put in the community box.
Okay.
The community's working on things like infrastructure. We're looking at just transitions. We're looking at redefining what an economy looks like. And I think it's really easy to sort of just put us in that box. And we are operationalizing just transitions from here to the Bay. So I just want to clarify that because I think the path to addressing climate change is local. So I just want to say that. I'm sorry to
Thank you.
interrupt.
That's okay. I wanted to thank our representatives from the advisors to investment funds. I want to thank my colleague Brad Hoylman for joining us, and we have many members of organizations in the audience and other representatives of the Controller's Office. Again, our City Councilwoman Helen Rosenthal. I learned a lot this morning. I hope you all did also. And I'm getting our panelists out on time because I promised them that we would be done at noon. So let's everybody give up.